Tzaraim Tovim. Good afternoon. I know this is a little bit later than usual, but it's just the flow of the day. That's the way it happened this week. Our Parsha this week is Parshat Acharei, and I've entitled this, When Do We Come Together and When Do We Separate? I also just want to indicate that for my Melrose B'nai friends, I wrote a message on your chat group that I will no longer be forwarding this to that group as a request from one of your folks, given the upcoming changes that are going on. So if you want to connect with me and you need to somehow find your way to my YouTube channel or to Facebook or whatever, if you just ese me at my email, which most of you should have, shulisrose, SHULISROSE at AOL.com, I will be glad to give you all the information so you can readily find these Parsha discussions. Acharei and Kedoshim during non-leap years are read together. They're both very, very short Parshiot. And this year, of course, we get to experience each of them in their own totality and fullness. I'm going to be looking at very opposite messages. The one this week speaking to separating out. When do we separate ourselves out? And for Kedoshim next week to look at what we're calling the democratization of Kedusha, which is a concept that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, has given us. So this week we're going to talk about the separation, okay? This is, to be sure, a most tricky and problematic balance. This is especially true for me in these troubling times where I do not want any separation or maintaining my proverbial lines in the sand to be misunderstood as emotions around alliances that are particularly sensitive at this juncture in our lives. I continue to stand for and work for and with multi-faith understanding, learning, dialogue. I continue to believe in social justice and equal access for all. I continue to work intentionally to bring people together across lines that divide. And I also do see a value in defining myself as separate. As I say consistently in my multi-faith work, it is really important that we can both celebrate what we share and simultaneously honor and regard our differences, even when, and especially when, we may not understand them. Our Parsha, or Parshiot when we read Acharei and Kedoshim together in non-leap years, introduces this clear notion of cultural differentiation, called by our scholars Chukat Hagoy, between Israel and the nations around us. This no doubt has been the cause of so much lack of understanding and empathy, as we have seen throughout history. As we will recall from our holiday of Purim, which happened a few months ago, we read in Parak Gimel, Vayomer Haman lemelech Achashverosh yishnu am echad mefuzar umeforad ben ha'amim b'kol medinot malchutach v'da'atehem shonot mikol am ve'et da'atei hamelech einam osim u'lamelech ein shava lahanicha. Haman comes to Achashverosh and says, there's a certain people, they are scattered, they are separate, they are separated amongst the people in your provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from everyone, and they don't even keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is of no use for the king to allow them to continue to be. And it is this point that Haman says, if it pleases the king, let it be written and decreed to destroy them, and I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents into the hands of those who perform this work, to bring it to the king's treasuries. The king takes off his ring, he gives it to Haman, and the king says, the silver is given to you, and the people is given to you. Do what you please with them. Whereas we often look at this King Achashverosh as foolishness, comparing him to, for example, Jafar and Aladdin, and looking at the Thousand Tales of the Arabian Nights and these foolish kings that are kind of these bumbling fools. For our purposes at this moment, let us consider that there is a total lack of understanding of the ways of these people, to the point that these differences were perceived as offensive. How do we counteract such a perspective? And sometimes we must ask ourselves, is it even possible to do so? As Alex Israel and many others who have thought and written about this topic explain, this legal principle of Jewish cultural differentiation or singularity has been at the center of many debates of Jewish law over time. From whether Jews are permitted to wear a doctor's uniform, the practice of men wearing a kippah in public, the celebration of a bat mitzvah, which was seen as imitating Christian confirmation ceremonies with no precedent in Jewish law per se, or Jews celebrating New Year's Eve in their respective secular countries. May rifles be fired as a salute at a military funeral? May Israel institute a moment of silence as a national memorial? Clearly, these practices come from other places. They are not found in the lore of our background. The practice of placing flowers on a grave has been debated. The question was always whether Jews could adopt a behavior that was performed in and indicative of a wider society not having its roots in Torah law or not. Even today, we understand that one response to this question is for ultra-Orthodox Jews to insist on speaking only Yiddish, not the languages of their European or Euro-Asian communities, or whatever their core language is, Ladino or whatever it was, and also wearing distinctive clothing, partly as an expression of their desire to do this very separation and to make it very clear. We learn in the Gemara that a lot of our eating laws, that a lot of the halachot of what we may and may not do, were actually crafted to maintain this separation. It must be stated that this quandary is merely a byproduct of not living in isolation. The fact is that all groupings and people adopt and adapt from the cultural practices around them. We just had Pesach. The many different traditions of charoset and different dishes that we prepare and bring to the table is indicative of regional influences many times, more than anything that can be traced back in terms of Jewish practice and law. Think of all of these different food customs for different groups of Jews and consider that these customs come with similarities to those regional dishes that they grew up with. Customs and dress, speech, and so many other daily components of our lives bring this cultural tension into our conversation continually. Thus, the insistence of some groups for maintaining Yiddish as the language of communication, dress practices not influenced by the outside world, and so on. In chapter 18, verses 3 through 4 of our Parsha, we read, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber al bnei Yisrael, v'amarta alehem ani Hashem Elokechem. K'maaseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yashavtem ba, lo ta'asu, u'k'maaseh eretz Canaan asher ani mevi'et lechem shema, lo ta'asu v'chukotehem lo telchu. Now, a lot of the discussion of the code of laws in Parak Yodchet and Parak Chaf 20, they frame the code that we see in chapter 19 of Vayikra. And here we say, speak to the children of Israel. Don't take on the practices of the lands of Egypt in which you dwelled, and don't pick up the practices of the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. Rather, et mishpatai ta'asu, you shall do my mishpatim, my chukot, you should observe, lalecha behem ani Hashem Elokechem, to walk in their way, I am the Lord your God. Ushmartam et chukotai ve'et mishpatai asher yaseh tamadam v'chai behem ani Hashem. By observing my statutes, my ordinances, and again we're saying this at the end of Kedoshim, of Acharei, which is the first chapter referenced, chapter 18. By observing all of this, you will be okay. I, the Lord your God, will protect you. It is most poignant to note that this is after we read in the beginning of our Parsha Acharei a reminder of what went so wrong with Aharon's sons, Nadav and Avihu, who were the inheritors of the priesthood by birth. Why did they do what they did? Again, many commentators want us to think that they were just so passionate about their devotion to God. However, given our discussions of the past several weeks and the level of instructive dictates provided, the leaders were supposed to lead by following these instructions, not by acting otherwise, which may have been reflective of the practices of other people with other purposes. This is always a challenge, as we do not live in cultural isolation and are apt to adopt and adapt from others as they do from us. So how do we maintain our singular identity and relationship with God and yet simultaneously remain a part of the world with so many ways to act and connect? We read in the beginning of chapter 16 of our Parsha, the very beginning of our Parsha. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe acharei mot shnei bnei Aharon b'keravtam lifnei Hashem v'yamut. God speaks to Moshe after the death of Aharon's sons, where they drew near to God and they had sacrificed. They had done as they had done, and then they died. So what does this teach us? Why is it repeated here? So God says to Moshe, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, daber Aharon achicha, va'al yavo b'chol et el HaKodesh, mibeit leparochet el pinei hakaparot asher al Aharon, v'lo yamut ki ba'anan ara'eh al hakaparot. God says to Moshe, Moshe, you need to go back and basically give Aharon a remedial course. Remind him that he could not come at all times into the holiest of holy with the dividing curtain in front of the curtain that is part of the ark, lest he be overcome with emotion and do something that he shouldn't do and die. In other words, this is the cautionary tale of Nadav and Avihu. He should not die the way his sons did. And the lesson of Nadav and Avihu will be for coming generations as well. In our Parsha, God warns Israel not to follow the practices of the nations among whom the nation of Israel will reside. Now, I do want to say that there are accommodations made for this. For example, in the Gemara, there is a lot of instruction about how to conduct business with non-Jewish neighbors, when to pay them for services, how to interact with them. And part of the discussion includes days of the week that you should not engage in business dealings, because we don't want, the Jewish people should not have their money being used to support Avodah Zarah. So it acknowledges that they're living together, acknowledges that there's business transactions, acknowledges that it's mutually beneficial to do so, but within the parameters of not compromising the needed separation. And there you have the tricky balance. And there are many, many other instances along those lines as well. Rashi notes as follows. When it says, you shall not walk in their ways, what has Scripture left unsaid when it spoke of the deeds of the Egyptians and the Canaanites that it felt compelled to add, ubechukoteim lo telchu? Rashi suggests that there are those who say this refers to cultural practices, for example, the theaters and the circuses. Rabbi Meir, however, says this refers to the ways of the Amorites, the idolatrous practices, which our rabbis have enumerated. Rashi further offers two interpretations of chukot. One is the culture of the nations, their lifestyle, their leisure. Obviously, their religious practices are forbidden. But here, the Torah is commanding Israel to exercise caution in copying even the conventions of other civilizations and cultural norms. So notice that I brought up theaters and circuses. So that might seem like odd, if you will. Think about for a moment anyone who's seen Barnum or, any number of documented cases of what the circus really was and what it was celebrating and how that's so not PC and so offensive to our modern sensibilities, where we struggle to be inclusive and we try to intentionally include everyone and validate everyone and not cause people to feel horrible because of physical differences, for example. There's something to that. And the theater, well, we know the theater, it can be gaudy in body in addition to being lovely. But clearly, the culture that produces these forms of entertainment, and we don't have to even imagine what that means in terms of our lives today, we understand that some of these convey ideas that we would not want to be part of the equation for our lives. The second option that Rashi presents is that we're referring to idolatrous practices, not to cultural norms. This debate is represented in the halacha as well. We turn first to the formulation of Rambam, the Maimonides, in the Mishnah Torah in Laws of Idolatry, chapter 11, verse 1. It is forbidden to follow the customs of the idolaters, to imitate them. We should not do so in dress, nor in hair trimming, nor in similar cultural mannerisms. For it is said, and you shall not walk in the customs of the nations, which I cast out before you. And that comes from next week's Parsha Kedoshim. Further, it states, and in their customs you shall not walk. That comes from this week's Parsha. We get why the two are put together. Furthermore, it states, take heed to yourself that you will not be tricked into following them. And that comes from Devarim, chapter 12. An Israelite shall be separated by them and be recognized by his clothes and his conduct, as he is different than they are in education and tendencies. So again, we go back to, do we dress like everybody around us, or do we specifically dress in a different way so that we do not succumb to whatever the style of the moment is? Do we eat the same foods everybody else does, or do we specifically maintain different practices to maintain our separation? It even says one should not build public places of the same design and architecture as are the places built for idolatry in order to attract a crowd as they did. Now, what's interesting about this is any of us who have traveled know very well that, again, the adopting and adapting in and out works. Go to an Iranian Jewish shul, go to Park Heights Avenue in Baltimore, go to Tehrangeles in Los Angeles, and you will note that a lot of the decor items, again, are more regionally informed than Jewishly dictated, per se, with all the Jewish accoutrements filled. But nonetheless, you will see colors, you will see materials that will be specific to that. When we were in St. Petersburg many, many years ago, when we were going to adopt our son, Brian Victor, we went into the large synagogue, the large Lubavitch synagogue in St. Petersburg. And it looked a lot like the churches. Again, in terms of materials, in terms of the use of certain stones and what have you, but with all the requirements of a synagogue. So we have to be very careful here. Clothing, architecture, hairstyle, conduct should all be distinctively Jewish. according to many. Back to our Hasidim and the very religious Jews in their insulated communities, their specific dress and their way of life. There is a sense of a desire to segregate, to prevent cultural influence and exchange. This is supported in the text potentially. However, the Ashkenazic authority, the Rama, Moshe Ursules, also known as Rama, who was born in 1530 in Krakow, takes a more limited view in which he teaches as follows. These restrictions apply only to things that Gentiles do for the sake of sexual looseness. For example, clothing that is immodest, or the ways of the Amorites. That is, practices stained by the blemish of idolatry. But norms that have a useful purpose, such as the custom for expert doctors to wear particular clothing so that the doctors will be recognized as specialists, one is permitted to wear such clothing. And this comes from the Shulchan Aruch, Yeredah 178.1. So it shows that this is a discussion that has happened through the ages, through our texts, through the generations of our living our lives in various places. Now, this gets even a little bit more complicated potentially, especially for those who prefer to use outtakes and read out of context. Consider in this light the following text from Shemot, chapter 12. In the midst of the Bnei Yisrael leaving Mitzrayim, the plagues and all that is happening at that point. It says, Torah achat yihye le'ezrach u'leger hagar b'tochacham. We know that when the Jews left Mitzrayim, and again, this may be something we discussed at our Pesach Seders, not all Jews left, and not everyone who left were Jews. It's easy and neat to paint it that way, but various historical indications would suggest otherwise. And we read at this point, there shall be one law for the native and one law for the stranger who resides in your midst. In other words, everyone should have both the responsibility, the rights, as well as the privileges by the law. There should not be prejudicial differentiation here. This verse comes to liken someone who comes to join the Bnei Yisrael, and some say a proselyte, somebody who converts, and others say just somebody who's a ger who's living amongst them, to again share the responsibility and the benefit of the commandments, according to the Mechelta. We then read, back to our Parsha, all the children of Israel did as the Lord had commanded Moshe and Aharon. They did. Here we are taught that we should all have one set of laws. What does that mean? Is it intended that this should be enacted as it is in singularly Muslim countries, for example, where everyone must dress according to law, not showing any different garb that could be identified as such in public, such as what happened recently in Saudi Arabia, with a Jewish leader being told to remove his kippah? Or does this lead us to the work of the Israel Democracy Institute, one of my absolute favorite places in Israel? I highly recommend that you all check it out, where the idea of Torah achat, one law, is that every person should be able to dress, worship, follow practices, and so forth, according to their wishes and preferences. So see, we have two very different notions of Torah achat. One says everybody must follow the majority. The other one says Torah achat means freedom of choice to all, freedom of practice to all, freedom of expression to all. And here, my friends, is one, if not our greatest challenge as a religious grouping, as Israel, as individuals, as Bnei Yisrael. The prophet Amos articulates this dynamic in our Haftarah for this week. In Parak 9, after he has cited all the wrongs of the nations and turns his attention to Israel, lest they think they are going to escape his wrath for wrongdoing, he indicates as follows. Hello, kivnei Cushimatem, aren't you like the children of the Cushites to me, children of Israel, says God? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Gafar and Aram from Kir? In other words, I didn't bring you out of Egypt. We celebrate this Yetziat Mitzrayim, But what does it mean? Does it mean, school's out for the day, go out and act on the playground however you want, and if people are hurt, so be it? No. It means you are free to take on the responsibility of creating something new. However, Amos continues. Hine einei Hashem Elokim b'mamlechet hachata'ah. God's eyes are on those in the kingdom who are sinning, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. I will not destroy the house of Yaakov, says God, but I will scatter the house of Israel amongst all the nations for its behavior at this point. By the sword shall the sinful of my people perish. And here we learn God's expectations of the Bnei Israel. Rashi amplifies this sanction when he teaches, why do we say halo kivnei kushim atem? Why aren't you like the Cushites to me? Why should I refrain from exacting retribution upon you since you didn't come back to me? You didn't understand why you were being free. You didn't take on the opportunity to act as free people in a responsible way. So why should I do anything different with you as opposed to others? Wasn't it out of my goodness, Rashi says that God is stating, the beginning of my choosing you, my taking you out of the land of Egypt? Now what is that to me? In other words, if they came out of Egypt only to be like everyone else, what's the point? A nation elects a leader to resolve the problems of corruption. And then that leader turns into another corrupt leader. We know this from our lives today. We live with a nearly impossible tension in our lives. At the same time, we are to remain specific and segregated in terms of personal observances, in terms of fulfilling the responsibilities that God has given to us, while not negating the right and need and agency of other people to do the same, while not altering our identity as we acknowledge the others in our midst. As I always say in my multi-faith work, and I suspect many of you can recite this with me by now, I know who and what I am when I walk in the room, when I am in the room, and when I leave the room. This is what allows me to engage in these interactions in a meaningful and respectful way, while acknowledging limits in terms of how this will influence me. This may have been the actual misdeed of Nadav and Avihu, and the warning given to Acharei, which we already know. He was silent, so he did acknowledge it. This was necessitated by the fact that it was not just people of the Amcha who were influenced by outside ways, but the very leaders who were to ensure the differentiation of when we come together with others and when we need to remain separate and distinct, and how to balance these seemingly conflicting aspects of our lives. As we begin the period of the Omer, and we think of the various characteristics of the Omer that we bring into our lives, may we all continue to show the respect and regard for differences amongst others while maintaining our own identity, and work together with all those who will join us to heal the increasingly dangerous fractures in our world. Shabbat Shalom. Wishing all a Shabbat of rest, comfort, and meaning. Lehitraat.